There's our guests from Israel. We're very glad to have you. I was excited when the Masorti movement approached me about a program. They didn't say what the program was or what it would be, and I was very excited that we have a program about this theme. It's easy in the United States to feel that we as an American Jewish community, especially a liberal Jewish community, both liberal religiously and liberal politically, are growing less connected to Israel. Yesterday here in the shul, the aunt of the Bar Mitzvah boys, a friend of mine named Yona Shem Tov, she runs the organization called Encounter, which brings American Jews to Israel to meet Palestinians and to hear about their experiences. Great organization. I've been on one of their trips. And we were talking about her experience that more and more liberal Jews are less and less engaged, less and less interested in, and the importance, I fully agree, of countering that trend. There's so many times when we read about the fourth election, which is almost certainly going to be the fifth election, and all kinds of crazy stuff that's going on, and so many things that may make us despair or feel disconnected. I want to do everything I can to counter that trend, and especially when things happen that are worthy of celebration. I'm learning more about the relatively recent Supreme Court decision recognizing non-Orthodox conversions, not only from the diaspora, which has been the case before. I see some of you who are on the call now. This is a particular, of particular relevance to your own lives. But those conversions, when performed within Israel, will also be recognized, thanks to the most recent Supreme Court decision. And the Masorti movement was among those fighting for many, many years to make that a reality. So this is really worth celebrating. And so we're very glad to have with us. You see three people before you. Rakefet Ginsburg is the CEO of the Masorti movement. She replaces somebody who was in that position for a while, Yishar Hess. She has been an emissary here in the United States for the Jewish Agency. She's been a social worker, and she's worked for the Masorti movement for a number of years. Peretz Rodman is from here, the Alter Haim. He's from the United States and has davened in our community in the past, and he's been in Israel for 30 years, and he is the head of the Beit Din. He's my rabbinic colleague, and he's the head of the Israeli Beit Din of the Masorti movement. And Karina, who I have not had the pleasure of meeting, is a Jew by choice, I think from Austria, is that right? Who is living in Israel, and we're very, very happy to hear about their thoughts and to engage on this question. I want to, before we begin anything else, I just thought we'd maybe, you tell us something about yourself. I gave the very, very small, chapter heading for who they are, but tell us a little bit about yourself. And do you want to begin, Karina? Is that okay? Can you start?
Okay. I'm a convert. I did my Giur with Rabbi Peretz here. Actually before the Supreme Court decision. I was born and grew up in Vienna to a family of social democratic atheists. And I had absolutely no connection with Judaism whatsoever when I grew up. That changed a little bit in the beginning of the 90s when I was part in a high school student exchange program from my school with a school in Givatayim near Tel Aviv. And that was a very impressive week that I spent here, and we stayed friends ever since, the family that hosted me. And in my 20s, I moved to Germany, to Hamburg, where I began to work for a small Jewish cultural organization, a group of people who organized readings and lectures and concerts. But I have to say, Judaism, especially its religious aspects, was something that was far away from me. I had never seen a shul from inside. I've never attended Kabbalat Shabbat. I was never a guest at a Shabbos dinner. And all of that changed in a couple of years ago in 2010 when I met a young man, an American Israeli, an American who had made Aliyah to Israel, who was on a journalist's program in Hamburg. And we fell in love. And for a couple of years, we were going back and forth between Germany and Israel. And 4 years later, in 2014, I packed my bags and I moved to Jerusalem. Yeah, so my partner, later my husband, had a profound Jewish education and he cared a lot about his Judaism. So I started to learn. And eventually I got to know Peretz via friends. That was in 2015. And at that time, I was already thinking about a giur, but we could not start our studies yet because I was not long enough in Israel for that. Perhaps, as you perhaps know, is that in Israel, to make sure that people do not convert for papers, one has to have a certain visa status to begin a conversion. And so we waited a couple of years and then we could start. And I think in 2019, right, Peretz? In June 2019, I completed the giur. And I mean, you know, it's never complete. It's always, I still consider it a beginning and not as an end of studying because I'm a total beginner in things, all things Jewish. But I was ready to appear in front of the Beit Din, and I could answer the questions. I could go to the mikveh. I immersed 2 times. I said the brachot, and I came out Jewish. And that was very, very moving for me. It was a very moving moment.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and a month later, there was another birth. I gave birth to our daughter, who's now 2 years old, and perhaps you will hear her in the back. She's with her dad now, but she's, always interested what's going on in the apartment, so you probably hear her talking. Yeah, we did, she's named after my husband's maternal great-grandmother and his grandmother. And we did a civil marriage in Vienna, where I come from, last year. And since now we're waiting that the pandemic ends so that we can do a chuppah in Yerushalayim. Yeah, Misrad Apnim, the Ministry of Interior, recognized my Jewishness and what's most important for us, the Jewishness of our daughter. So that's in a nutshell my story, why I'm here.
Thank you. Can I ask you, what access to a mikveh did you have?
Well, the Masorti movement has a mikveh in Kibbutz Hanaton in the north. And this is where the Beit Din took place. And this is where the mikveh was. What was funny is that I think the Balanit had no time on that day. So, and the others, the Beit Din were 3 male rabbis, and there was also there was also no woman around. So who would witness my immersion? So in the end, we decided that my later husband did it. So we could both go to the mikveh, which was great.
Thank you. Rakefet, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me today. It's really a pleasure. I'm CEO for the Masorti movement in the last 5 months. As you said at the beginning, I'm a social worker by profession. I worked the movement before and then left and worked in Natali, an organization who works with resiliency and national trauma, and got back during the COVID to work in the Masorti with Kihilot and everything. So I think we all understand what a national trauma is right now. I was born in Israel. I live in Rosh Hain. I have 3 boys. I grew up in a family that both my parents were ultra-Orthodox before they got married, but became secular or felt like this is the way of life for them. Although in Israeli, even secular, those of you who know, the culture here, they may be in some kind of Masorti, but they don't recognize themselves as religious. That's secular. and I got married. My husband came from Argentina, from a conservadox family, and we always talked about the opportunity to have Judaism that is open, that men and women can sit together, that whole family can sit together and pray together, and egalitarian, but it's there, you know, across the ocean, not here. And when my oldest son got to and became 10, we thought we need to look for something that's going to be more egalitarian, and we started to look around, and we found different opportunities. But when we got to US, when I got to US as a shlicha, I realized that there are so many opportunities. And when we got back, we joined the Masorti, the conservative synagogue here. We're members of the conservative, the Masorti synagogue in Hod HaSharon. Rabbi Peretz talked about the egalitarian section at the Kotel. We had the privilege to have our youngest son bar mitzvah in the egalitarian section at the Kotel, which was an amazing, amazing experience. Funny enough, my parents that were both, you know, even my parents were born here, are Israelis, and they speak Hebrew, and my mother is a kindergarten teacher. And I told her, you know, you're going to be called to the Torah in your grandchild bar mitzvah. And she said, I can't read. I said, why can't you read? She said, I don't know how to read it. I said, what do you mean you don't know how to read? You'll read the blessing. It's written in Hebrew. I said, but I never read something that is, you know, written in Hebrew like that. I never saw how it looks like. And that was amazing for me to see that you can grow up here, you know Hebrew, you know how to read, but you never really saw that to understand that it's just a regular Hebrew letters that you can read. Not chanting. I'm talking about reading the blessing itself. So seeing my parents excited so much when they had the opportunity to realize that there is option to be next to their grandchild, you know, for my mother to be next to her grandchild, and for me, that's an amazing thing. And part of my mission, or my wish as a executive director of this movement, is to have as many people to at least know that this opportunity is here. We see that more and more in Israel today. People are more and more aware to those opportunities, but not enough, still not enough. And I think if we can get to more and more people just to see what it is, they don't necessarily have to join, but just to realize that this is a egalitarian option in Israel is a real option near their house. I think if we'll get there, we're in a good shape. So that's our mission now. Thank
you. Thank you. Peretz, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey and your professional.
I'm a native Bostonian, third generation, and never expected to find myself living so far east of where I grew up. But I've spent most of my life here. Got here at the very end of my teens, spent a couple of years, went back to graduate school, married somebody who told me on our first date that she was moving back to Israel when she graduated from college. So we did, back and forth. We've lived here now for 31 years. And we made a pledge when we got here 31 years ago that we would stay for 50 and then we'd make up our minds. So far, so good. You can check in another 19 years, you can check and see where we are. I've done a lot of things professionally since then in Jewish education and in administrative things, and translating and editing. And most of my work until COVID-19 hit was freelance rabbinic work, working with families from North America and elsewhere around the world who can come for bar and bat mitzvah for their kids, at the Kotel or at Metzada or other places, sometimes in ancient synagogues in the Galilee and places like that. That, of course, came to a screeching halt a while ago. So I'm doing a lot more translating and editing, but I've been a freelancer for many years. And as a volunteer, I'm the head of the Beit Din for conversion here, and in a titular fashion, also the Beit Din that does divorce law here as well. We also do gitin here. We can issue a halachic divorce. The government doesn't recognize it, but that's another story. But the government does recognize our conversions here and has, which is why, for example, we were able to welcome Karina, who understated how well she did. We've never before or since seen anybody who just answered all the questions we asked, and then we asked harder questions, she knew the answers. So you can imagine it was a lot of fun being her teacher. We've been recognized, our Beit Din has been recognized by the government of Israel under order from the courts, not because the Knesset ever legislated. The Knesset could never figure out how to legislate anything about conversion, in 70 years. But the High Court of Justice decided 25 years ago that our conversions have to be recognized, and they generally are. So what's changed lately? We wouldn't have to tell Karina, I'm sorry, you have to wait 2 years until you get your A5 visa and an identity number and have permanent, semi-permanent status here. Now we can work with people who are here as students, as foreign workers, as refugees, and I can tell you about some of the people who've called us in the last 6 weeks or so, and told us that, you know, can we work with them now? That's what's really changed. It's tremendous fun doing this work. Again, on a volunteer basis, it's important to us that the staff that actually does most of the work is supervised by somebody who has no financial interest in this. I don't make a penny from this work, from the work of supervising the Beit Din. But it's the best hobby a rabbi could ever have, because I meet all these people who are either sociologically Jewish already, or really not, really coming from totally outside the Jewish people, often, like Karina, partnered with Israeli Jews, who want to be part of the story here. They want to be part of the culture. They want, and most important, most interesting is they always tell me, I want to be part of my partner's family life. The extended family life of Jewish families in Israel is the bedrock of society. And all of us who moved from North America and Europe and Australia and all over Western Europe, we had no idea of that, because most of us came alone without parents. But when I ask people who are really not sociologically Jewish in any way, no Jewish background, why do you want to be Jewish? We'll even, in this country, we're even willing to let you, encourage you to bring up Jewish children and be a non-Jewish mom of Jewish children. In the diaspora, the rabbis are skittish about that, but here we've got the cultural wind at our back rather than in our face in that regard. And the answer is always, I want to be part of this extended family life, which is, so again, I learned so much about Jewish identity and about Israeli identity and Israeli culture by doing this. It's tremendous, very rewarding.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about, you said that in 70 years the Knesset has not successfully managed to make a policy about conversion, and I remember the various iterations over the years. I remember the Ne'eman Commission, which Ruvain Hammer was our representative on, and earlier this year, it was in 2020, but earlier this Jewish year, thanks to Dubara in the Masorti movement, we had a program with Elazar Stern to talk about his work regarding conversion. Just give us a teeny bit of history, like the current, until now, there has been a National Conversion Institute, right, in which the Masorti movement was involved, but those people had difficulties when it actually came time to Beit Din. Is that the...
Rakefet, do you want to respond to this? Should I? Or how would you like
do you want to tell the whole history? We can go through. I'll say a little bit about the political situation that relate to that, and I think Rabbi Peretz, if you want to add to that, please. The issue of the status of those who joined the Jewish nation or the Jewish people in Israel is an issue for many years, probably since Israel established. And if you heard the whole, if Dvorah already had this program with you, so you probably know some of the things that happened, who is the Jew, what does it mean, what are the privilege that one that joined the Jewish nation can get or not, and what does it mean for the Jewish state? Now, since this whole issue of the movements, of the conservative and reform movements, how we recognize them in the Jewish state is an issue. I think conversion is one of those issues that came up. Do we get decisions that relate to Jews in Israel and outside of Israel? So many times we see that things that relate to the streams, the conservative and the reform movement outside of Israel, the political system gets somehow more and less with understanding that this is the majority of the Jewish people outside of Israel, especially in US, and that's why we can get things that happening there. So if there's a conversion there or things like that, it's more open for that. But in Israel, since the organization, so especially the chief rabbinate, is strong and has an authority, this is a matter of power. And can you have, or can you recognize the movement without taking the power from the chief rabbinate? That's much more complicated. And the political system, that's why many times the political system is behind actually people. So we saw people, as Rabbi Peretz and as Karina said, they did it. I mean, Karina converted before the law. She didn't convert because of the law. She converted because this is the value that she wanted to do. This is something valuable for her, not necessarily by being a citizen or not being a citizen. But the idea that the state recognized those people, because they were recognized as Jews, again, not by the chief rabbinate, but the chief rabbinate is an issue for itself. But the country recognized the giur, the process for itself, but didn't recognize them for citizenship by Chok HaShvut, by the law of return, but didn't recognize them as equal Jews, for example, like me that was born here, that was born Jew. This is the fact that Karina and I could be both Jews, both conservative Jews, but I am recognized by the law of return and Karina is not. That's something that this decision made by court changed. Now Karina and I are equal. And that's the importance. I think the fact that we can relate to people that we accepted to the Jewish people as equal, that's the issue, that's the importance. And that was very important for us to say, it's not enough just to say they're Jews. Accept them as equal to everybody else. Accept them like the country or the state recognize every other Jew in the world. That was changed, and I'm happy to do that. I'm happy that it happened. What I think is that the government didn't want to decide it by itself. So the government couldn't decide it because of the strength or the power that ultra-Orthodox has in the Israeli politics today. But they couldn't decide anything else. And that was pretty interesting. They didn't decide, and those committees that you mentioned, Ne'eman committee and later Nisim committee, and there are a few things that happened during this time, but still a decision by the political system couldn't be done. And I think part of that is because the power that the ultra-Orthodox had on one side, and the understanding that it's not really possible to eliminate Jews that converted by reform and conservative movements. On the other hand, this is something that they couldn't find any decision in between, so they pushed it into court, and court decided, as in many other things that relate to religious and state in Israel, the court decided for all of us instead of the political system. That's something that I think that's a problem for itself, that our political system cannot decide, but many issues that relate to religious and state, eventually, because of the power that the ultra-Orthodox have in Israeli government, court have to decide for us.
I just wanted to add, the members of our Kahal might remember this. One of the justices on the Supreme Court, the Judge Daphna Barak Erez, she prayed with us on Rosh Hashanah 2 years ago here at Anshe Chesed. And it was a real thrill to have her recite Tefillah L'Shalom HaMedina. That was the last time we gathered here for Rosh Hashanah in the big room with all the people. So maybe next time too. Karina, wow. Karina, you as Rakefet said, this is a gesture of equality for you as a Jew. Do you feel that you have been treated equally? What's your experience of living with neighbors and with people in your Masorti community and beyond, and your husband and the people that he knows? Do you feel like you have been with this or in other ways welcomed as equal or held at arm's length? What's your experience been?
Well, I was thinking about that before we met here. How was I treated, and did anything change? Well, I had the feeling that among the Israelis, the question of my Jewishness or not Jewishness before the Giur was not that important. what was more important was my attitude and my feeling towards the Jewish state. And yeah, that was my impression, because and that was a tricky question, because many Israelis, by the way, also even in the Ministry of Interior, we had a moment like that. They would ask me, they would say, you're coming from a more or less wealthy nation. What do you want in Israel? Because a lot of Israelis go the other way, right? They go to the US or even to Europe for work. So the question was, which reason could there possibly be to go the other direction? Yeah, what can I say? So I think the reaction of more secular Israelis is that they do not really understand my motivation, because, as I said, I can live in Israel as a non-Jew with all rights and benefits. I even could become a citizen of the Jewish state without being Jewish. There is a track that has to do with marriage and a couple of years, a large number of years, but still, of living in the country. So it's not necessary, so to speak. There is access to the labor market, would be for me as a non-Jew. There is health insurance, education for my child, everything. So that's
at least for me, you got frozen. I think for you too. Okay. I want to, well.
And as I said,
yeah,
sorry, my internet connection is not so great.
Yeah, we got a little glitch here. So let me ask you another question. We can get back to you in a bit. This past week, there was a really interesting op-ed. Tom Friedman of the New York Times is a really, I think, very astute observer of lots of things around the world, and obviously spent a lot of time in Israel and knows a lot about the country. And he observed that the social fragmentation in Israel and the United States has some real similarities. And I'm just thinking about the way in which this decision, in the ways that you guys said, maybe doesn't change all that much. People have still been going through Gior beforehand, and people still had citizenship paths beforehand. But the Shrine give out of the Haredi population and the right-wing population, this is the end of the world. We're going to go to the legislature. We're going to reverse this. Even the not so Haredi politicians on the right scream that they're going to reverse this, and it just makes me think about Israeli society and its fragmentation. And I'm interested if you could reflect. Do you think that the decision has been, is the source of anger on the part of large parts of the population? Do you think they will succeed in reversing this? Do you wonder how you all live together in society?
You want the good news first or the bad news first?
Well, let's start with the good news first.
The good news first is social science researchers are interested in Jewish identity in Israel over the past decade and a half or so have noticed that and recorded that when asked which, the word we use in Hebrew is zerem, which stream, which denomination of Judaism, of religious Judaism do you identify with? First of all, the largest group says none, but of all the rest, of the total, somewhere between 10 and 15% regularly will say either Reform or Conservative, Masorti. And that shocked us because that's way out of proportion to the numbers in our institutions, which are still small and weak. Growing stronger, growing more numerous, doing well, they're doing great work, but still, not the big swath of society that says, yeah, we identify with them. So we have become the shul that many Israelis don't go to yet, which is it sounds like a funny thing to claim as a great success, but that is a great success. In other words, I think that the Israeli public largely understands that there's more than one way to be Jewish, a message that we've been putting out along with our Reform colleagues in those terms for many years. There's more than one way to be Jewish, religiously Jewish. And so that's one side of it. The other side of the good news is that the religious establishment, as it between 30 and 20 years ago fell into the hands of really ultra-Orthodox people, has made itself less and less appreciated, to say the least, by the Israeli public. The raw number of people who go to the state rabbinate to get married every year does not increase, although our population has doubled in the last 25 years. So it's become more and more irrelevant. The Orthodox religious establishment, not Orthodox Judaism. There are plenty of liberal Orthodox Jews here with whom we have common cause, and including some who are committed to bringing down the state rabbinate now very openly. But the religious establishment has made itself hated by much of the public, resented by much of the public. Additionally, and this isn't good news for Israeli society, ultra-Orthodox society got an awfully bad press over the past year during the pandemic, because in so many cases it was elements of, not all of by any means, but large segments of the ultra-Orthodox population who flouted all the rules about masks and so on, who have stayed away from vaccinations. And so among those populations, the rate of infection with COVID-19 has been the highest, much more than all the rest of Israeli society. And so ultra-Orthodox people are largely resented even more now. Now, that's not a good thing for Israeli society, but it does maybe mean that we can be successful in the efforts we've been making as a movement over the past 20 years, 15 years or so, to begin to find allies in the political parties who can build their own political careers on promoting Jewish religious pluralism in Israel, within right-wing parties, within center parties, within left-wing parties, not in the ultra-Orthodox parties, and not in the parties that identify themselves with the Orthodox establishment. So we were hopeful. It's going to be slow, but you can feel like the tectonic shifts underneath you when you talk to people, when you see people, when you meet people. People know who we are. They don't quite understand yet what we are. They don't really necessarily, they may not even be asking the questions to which we have good answers yet, but it's happening slowly. The bad news is that the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox political parties have considerable power in this crazy situation where for 71 years we've never had a majority party, and so you have to build a coalition. And only about 15 or 20 years ago did the Hebrew Language Academy come up with good words for coalition and opposition, which nobody uses. We call them koalitia and oppositia. Because the ultra-Orthodox parties are able to help the right wing, which has a clear majority in Israel, the political right, build successful coalitions and somewhat stable governments over the years. They have extraordinary power. You asked about mikveh before. So we had not a High Court of Justice case, an actual Supreme Court appeal in which we won the right to use any public mikveh, we and the Reform, any public mikveh that is used for conversion by the religious establishment. The court said, you let them do it. The Reform and Conservative are also recognized Jewish communities. That's the term in the law. Excuse me. They have to be able to use it. So what happened? The Knesset did succeed in making the mikveh, all the public mikvahs, subservient to the state rabbinate, which they weren't before. And so we're closed out again, which is why we have to go either up north to Kibbutz Hanaton, which Karina described, or down to a suburb of Be'er Sheva in the south, where the city owns the mikveh and not the religious establishment. It's a complicated legal situation, but we have two places we can go, sometimes a third. And we also have the Mediterranean in good weather. We've done that too. But it could very well be that although the government of Israel, the Knesset of Israel, has never been able to figure out how to make legislation about conversion, that on this point, given the situation now, it could be that they'll come together and legislate that our conversions will not be respected. And that would pass muster legally. They have the ability to do that. The court waited 15 years before it finally said, okay, we're not going to give you any more time to find a solution. We're going to rule on this case that they ruled on about 6 weeks ago, I guess it is. But in the decision itself, it says, this is only, our order that you have to recognize these conversions by the non-Orthodox movements here only stands as long as there's no legislation. You want to legislate? Bavakasha, legislate away. It shouldn't be us making the law, it should be you making the law. And if a law gets made, it may very well be not in our favor.
That makes me wonder, Rakefet, to ask you this. I mean, of course, it has been the case over these many years that the slow growth of this, these liberal movements or dissenting movements, we had only dreamed that it will not all be, English-speaking immigrants, that it will be native-born Israelis. And I'd just like for you to reflect a little bit on how you see that going. Are there more and more, or what optimism? What is the cause for optimism of more and more people like yourselves?
Unfortunately, there are not enough American immigrants to Israel, so we have to fill those lines by ourselves. As I said, I was born here. My parents were born here. I have except me living 3 years in US. I've never been in US before those 3 years, and I have 40 cousins who all live in Israel. So for me, knowing about diaspora and Jews outside of Israel was something, I hardly knew about it, and I hardly knew about the opportunities of Judaism that there are outside of Israel. So all I knew about Judaism and how I can connect was through life here. I grew up in a place I grew up in Petah Tikva, where there are only Orthodox rabbis. Today there is a conservative synagogue there, and I think it was even a reform one that was open. I live in Rosh Hashanah today. There are 200 Orthodox synagogues, but one reform here in this city, and very close around, in all those cities around, there is at least one reform and one conservative in almost every town around here. So we're getting more and more, and those people who come to those synagogues are Israelis. Most of them were born here or married to someone like me that was not necessarily born here, but immigrated or made aliyah to Israel. Our children grow up here, and that's natural for them. I must tell you, last week, my youngest son joined the army, and he called on Friday and said, "Ima, you won't believe, I already had the first argument about conservative movement and reform and the differences, and with my friends in the army." So, and he's there less than a week. So this is something that I could just only dream about, having those discussions in my army service. The idea that there are more and more kids like that, Israelis, that's not natural for them, and they talk about it, and we have about 1,500 Noam kids that going all over, and they come from Israeli families that have no connection to by the way, not necessarily even conservative families, but just families who look for something, or they joined because their friends joined, and they learn about Judaism that is egalitarian. They learn about Judaism that is open. They learn about more than, like Rabbi Peretz said, there is more than one way to be a Jew. And this is a very important thing. And I think, this week we're celebrating the 73rd Independence Day. We're talking about Jewish state. We have to start to talk about Jewish pluralistic state. That's the term that we have to put, not just Jewish state, Jewish pluralistic state, because for many years, Jewish state was Orthodox state. And we're not talking about Orthodox state. We're talking about Jewish, and Jewish is more than one way. And we have to make sure that we're saying that, not just acting that. Now, we see that around the government or the institutions are behind most of the people that live here. I think it happens in other countries as well, that many changes happening in the field. You see that outside with your friends and people, but the organizations or especially governments are slower than most of us. So we'll see that change. We have the first reform rabbi in the Knesset this time. This is a change. This is a big thing for us, and we couldn't dream that it can happen 10 years ago. So I'm very optimistic about Israelis. I think we're getting there. We looked for something for many years. I think for many years, my generation thought that Judaism is for Orthodox and only for Orthodox. We have nothing to do with that. I think we know today that we do have, this is our Judaism as well, and we should take ownership about our Judaism in our own way, and there are ways around.
Beautiful. Who's the reform rabbi in the Knesset and which party?
Gilad Kariv, he's was the CEO for the reform movement. Rabbi Gilad Kariv, and he's a Knesset member from the Labor Party.
There aren't that many of those, so Yeshua to him. So, all right, I want to invite the members of our Kahal to ask a question. You can use the raise hand function. Ruvain has proposed one question. What did he say there? Okay, Ruvain says, and then Sarah Cole, which will go next. In voting both Israel and the United States, fertility, the key. Immigration has been under 35K for the last 20 years, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Okay, what's the question though, Ruvain? Do you want to unmute? Or not? Sarah.
Question is, which is
yes, this is Ruven. I just want to observe that both in the United States and in Israel, if you have one person or at least one adult person, one vote, the more adult people you have, the more votes you have. So if you have more children, you'll have more votes.
Yeah, well,
we're the only Jewish community in the world with a fertility level above replacement, I'm told. Excuse me. But the
well, if the Orthodox, yes, but if the Orthodox have more children, they'll have more votes.
Absolutely. The continued growth of the ultra-Orthodox community is not a sustainable trend, though, because the rest of us cannot afford to support with child support and all sorts of other ways the ultra-Orthodox community. More than half of the men in the ultra-Orthodox community report that they do not work. Some of them, a good number of them, may be working under the table, but they're not earning much money. They're really spending their time in kollel, in Torah study. So not only is it economically not a viable model for the rest of us to continue to support a large and growing Haredi population, but there's also a lot of unrest within the Haredi community at the enforced poverty and ignorance in the hardcore Haredi world. It's not true of the whole Haredi world, but the experience of the past year in which people saw that because of their rabbinic leadership, people were dying in large numbers in their community of COVID-19 and suffering the long COVID-19, which goes on and on and on and has all sorts of ill effects. That has undermined respect for the authority of the rabbis in the ultra-Orthodox community a little bit. So something's got to give, something's got to change, and it'll happen probably dramatically in ways that nobody quite foresees the day before. A Knesset vote, some kind of a social rebellion within parts of the ultra-Orthodox world, maybe within their parties, could very well come from ultra-Orthodox women who insist that things must change in their communities because they really bear the burden not only of raising children, but largely of supporting their families. Because ultra-Orthodox women work in much larger proportion than ultra-Orthodox men. So it is an issue, but it can't continue to become, the ultra-Orthodox community can't grow to be a majority here and still have a sustainable country.
Sarah Cole, do you want to pose a question?
Yes, actually, I had two questions. I'm sorry. There was a comment that up until recently, you couldn't come to Israel and convert very quickly because they were concerned that you were coming to get the papers. And that when I was in Cuba several years ago, first, I was fascinated and excited to hear that the Jewish population there was growing, that lots of non-Jews who were married to Jews wanted to convert. But then someone told me that that was because that was their way of getting out of Cuba. So I'm wondering whether this concept of not, I mean, are you seeing a lot of that where there are people who want to convert in order to emigrate legally to Israel? And then my second question is sort of, do you see any way out of the political logjam that has persisted through 4 elections, whether there are going to be any changes that would allow some group, even if it's not a group we want, but some group to form a government, hopefully without Bibi.
I'd like, Rakefet, with your permission, I'll address the first question and Pent the second too.
Sure.
The people who've spoken to us in the past 6 weeks whom we hadn't met before largely people who haven't much to gain. They're like Karina, people who are like a friend of mine whom the government, made go back to Sweden and do her study for 9 months in Sweden, although she'd already studied here, and do her conversion there, and then wait 9 months more before applying for Aliyah under the law of return. Clearly, the Ministry of the Interior was onto something, because they knew that tall, blonde Swedish women, that she is one, are fleeing oppression in Sweden by coming to Israel. And we didn't know it. We just never knew that. Now, the people who called us in the past 6 weeks, only one of them is somebody who really is in a tough situation in life. He's a Darfurian refugee whose family, he got here alone with other kids, other young teenagers 20 years ago. This is his country, this is his home, this is his culture at this point. He wants to be a Jew. And he even has the kind of legal status here that means he's not about to be tossed out of the country. Might be a long road to citizenship, but he's not going to get tossed out. No, we do not find that there are people. We haven't been getting calls from, Thai and Romanian guest workers saying, hey, can I do a quick conversion? The people we see are serious, and their motivation is complex and sincere, at least as well as best we can tell from all the people that I've met. But the larger political situation, I'm happy to
pass on to someone else.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the second question?
What we get reported here in the United States is there's been a fourth election, but you are still completely paralyzed in terms of being able to form a coalition. Now, from the non-Orthodox American point of view, of course, we would like a government that was without Bibi and didn't have the very strong Orthodox control. But we've also read things that indicate that maybe the Israelis are considering a way of somehow revamping the electoral system to get out of this unending tie. And I wondered whether there was any truth to that, whether you had any sense that there was some way for the Israelis to form a stable government, hopefully without Bibi.
That's probably the biggest question for the Israelis right now. I mean, we don't know if we're going to the fifth elections or we're going to have a coalition and a government finally. And if we will have a government, will it be stable? Because we did have a government in the last year, and stable is not the right word for it. Or at least, we can't consider that as a stable government that we had. It's an issue. I think, I want to say that democratic countries in general, or democracy in general, all over the world probably has a crisis or in a crisis. We see that in more and more countries. We saw that in US, we see that in Israel, in different ways. I'm not sure we do have a solution for that right now. I think part of that is the COVID, and this is something that I'm saying as someone who deals with crisis in the last few years. I think a long-term crisis increase the instability of political situations. And if it wasn't very stable before, a long-term crisis make it even worse. And that's what we see in Israel right now. I don't think we're going to see a very stable government very soon. Although it may be if something going to change, and it will take time. It will take a long time. Now, even to build a coalition right now, we have a few weeks that they can negotiate till they're going to have they can have a final decision, or say if they could or could not. And later, if they could not, then the president can give the opportunity for the other side to start all over, and it can take another few weeks. So if we will have another elections, it's going to be probably, I think we're talking about September or October or something like that. I'm not sure exactly when, but it's going to take a while till we're going to have another elections. And even if we won't have another elections, I'm not sure we're going to have a very stable political government. It means two things. As Rabbi Peretz said, there are good news and bad news. The good news that they can't get any decisions that are against us if there is no political situation that is stable. That's good for itself. You can't hurt more. the bad news is that we can't get forward, and in a crisis like we all and all countries around the world, this is a global crisis, the COVID. We need a stable government to move on, to get out of this economic crisis, to this health crisis. Even though we do vaccinate, I mean, not all of us, but a lot. I think they talk about 6 million people that already got their vaccine in Israel. Still, nobody knows if it's forever or we'll need more in another 6 weeks, 6 months, or what's going to happen. So we do need to be aware to the fact that there's a need for a stable government and a stable a coalition, but we probably won't have it very soon. And it means that, and this is something that we take back to our movement, I think. When the central government or the central leadership is so weak, the local leadership getting stronger. So we need more local leaders that's going to be stronger, stronger rabbis, more strong, community leaders. This is the local leadership is getting stronger, and I think we'll see that around the world. We'll see more and more communities that take care for themselves, for the good and for the bad of that.
That's actually true in the United States, but yeah.
Karina, you look like you were going to say something before.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I guess there are probably people who try to convert 4 papers, but my experience was it's not that easy. It took me like 4 years, and I don't think anybody who's not meaning it would pass Peretz class and would be able to pass the Beit Din. Okay. So it's a pretty serious thing, and of course nobody came to my house and checked my kitchen, but this is a small place. We live in Jerusalem. It's if my kashrut observant friends would not eat in my kitchen, Peretz would have heard about it, I'm sure. so I guess because the place is small, I mean, sure, theoretically it might happen. Yeah, but I don't think that there are lots of people who actually can do it.
Thank you.
David Kornfeld posed a question to me, which I will pose to the group, and then we'll turn to the one that Debbie and Marty posed, and let that be the final question. David Kornfeld asked me to ask you to what extent this has any effect on, is there any change with respect to, there are still lots and lots of people who had emigrated from the FSU in the 90s, from the former Soviet Union in the 90s, who did not have halachic status, who wanted, and that's been a challenge for the government to try to deal with the non-Jewish status of all these folks. Is that relevant? Has there been any change in that element?
We see each month when the Beit Din meets, we do see almost every time 1 or 2 or 3 women they themselves or their families came from the former Soviet Union, who are not halachically Jewish, who are sociologically Jewish. We made a policy decision after some pretty serious study to follow the advice of many liberal Orthodox rabbis in Israel and outside, which is to do conversion for them without an awful lot of requirements, if they're already part of the Hebrew-speaking majority here. Because it's a national need. That's something that rabbis have been saying since the French Revolution. I think that we would see many more of those people if we had a bigger operation going, if we could pay teachers better, offer courses in a variety of languages, including in Russian, although Russian is less relevant now, all these years later, 3 decades later. We would see a lot more people and help solve that demographic problem. If we had the resources to do it. This isn't a fundraising meeting, and it wasn't intended to be making any fundraising appeals. But it's true that if we had the money to spend, we would open courses all over the country. We would advertise. We would find lots more rabbis to meet more often to form a Beit Din, and we would convert many, many, many more people, because it is a problem. It is an issue.
Karina, what did you say?
When a mikveh in Jerusalem would be amazing.
Yes, a mikveh would be nice here and there too. By the way, when the government made its legislation and dealt with the court, they also the government of Israel undertook it must be 8 or 9 years ago, Rakefet, it was before you left and before you came back, to build mikvaot for the
The decision
non-Orthodox.
about the mikveh?
Yeah, right. They're supposed to be building in every major city a mikveh that is in the hands of either the conservative or the reform movement, Masorti or reform. We haven't seen.
We're still negotiating that. We're still negotiating about it. I just wrote an email last week about it. Yeah, we're still on it, but it's a process like everything else.
We haven't seen a single brick yet.
You know that this is a not exactly parallel example, but it was the case in the 1960s when there was national court order desegregation. There were cities in the South that disbanded their school systems rather than let Black children come in, and closed public pools and public parks rather than let Black people enjoy them. And when I heard that the government turned over the mikvaot to the rabbinate rather than let any of the liberal streams use them, it just reminded me of that. We're having this program because it is, it's already Rosh Chodesh Iyar in Israel, or will soon be Rosh Chodesh Iyar. We're having this program because it is the week of Yom HaAtzmaut, and we want to celebrate good news about good people working to make the Israel that we can continue to love and support and believe in and feel connected to as our Jewish brothers and sisters. So I'm going to let the last question be from Debbie and Marty Greenberg, who posed the question on the dark side of sleepless nights. What keeps you up at night? But also in the category of Od lo avda tikvatenu, hope is not yet lost. What are the things that give you hope for the coming, let's say, the 73rd year of the state of Israel and the future? Any thoughts? What keeps you up at night and what gives you hope for the future?
I'll start with what keeps me up at night. It keeps me up at night, the split that we have between groups in Israel. It keeps me up at night to see the split between different groups, the hatred that sometimes people have to each other just because they disagree about small and sometimes stupid things. It doesn't matter if it's politics or Judaism or whatever. I mean, the fact that people can hate and have sometimes even violence against each other because of those things, I think that's our biggest problem today. That's the split between groups in this country. The hope, I see the next generation. I see how open they are. I see how they open to learn Judaism and to connect and to reconnect to their roots. And I feel like, Jewish state is really a mission for them. And I'm glad to say that because it's the fourth generation that lives here. It's not obvious for fourth generation to feel that this is important home for them. So that gives me a lot of hope that they'll fight for this country. Even if we fight with each other, they'll at least fight for this country. That's hope.
I have a different thing that keeps me up at night, and that's the concern. As somebody with a dual Israeli-American Jewish identity, I find myself often interpreting one group to the other in both directions over the last 30, 40 years. What worries me is that the very different historical experiences of the Jewish people in the diaspora, especially North America and in Israel, where we understand what it means to be Jewish differently, and we're experiencing life very differently, and the challenges we face are very different. That could, if we weren't careful, lead to the creation of two Jewish peoples instead of one. And sometimes I worry that might happen. Often I worry that we're headed in that direction. But what gives me hope is that I think the organized Jewish community and the leadership of the Jewish community in the diaspora, and especially in North America, is very aware of that from their end as well. And that's why you see Birthright and Honeymoon Israel and all sorts of other initiatives to create dialogue, to bring Israelis here, to bring Jews there. The Ruderman Foundation, based where I grew up in Boston, has a program here to train people in an MA program, especially in public life, in an MA program about American Jewry at Haifa University, and they bring Israeli political leaders to meet the Jewish community in the United States. So the question is being addressed, the problem is being addressed. And all those people who come and celebrate with us here, bar and bat mitzvah and weddings and things, all those people who come for a semester of school and then come back for a year, all those people who, who send their kids to the 6-week programs in the summer. That's what gives me hope. We are still one people, even though we're kind of being pulled in 2 different directions.
Karina, you want to add anything?
That there's not so much that keeps me up at night, but I can say what keeps me up.
Ida, your daughter keeps you up.
Keeps you up at night, yeah.
And that's this is also what gives me hope. Like it's my family and the family my husband and I are building here in Jerusalem. And maybe I want to add to the question before that was difficult to understand about if I feel equal or not, because my internet connection wasn't good. So maybe I can add just one point that, of course, in one aspect, I will never be equal, not in a legal sense, but in another sense is that I cannot catch up, so to speak. I did not grow up Jewish. I don't have another history. But my daughter grows up Jewish. And that moves my husband and me a lot. She's 2 years old. On Friday night, when she lights candles with me, she covers her eyes and she said, "Amen." Yeah. So it's amazing, and we have tears in our eyes every time that happens. So this is what gives me hope. And then maybe I want to say that what amazed me in the last year, as difficult as it was for everybody all over the world, is how Israel managed the pandemic. It was just incredible. And friends in the US and my family in Europe, it's a totally different story in terms of like how it feels, how depressed people are or how gloomy they are. And in Israel, it's just different. It was just a feeling of course, it was a feeling of we will go through that together, and that was incredible. And everybody I talked in Europe about that could hardly believe that this is possible. So I really do feel this is a wonderful place to raise a family.
I want to add to that just a sentence. I think we are a very resilient society, and I think that connects to our Jewish people. The fact that we grew up, this nation, Jewish people suffered for, along the years and got through so many issues that we take that and say, we can do that. We'll go through this. I think that increased our resiliency as a nation.
I want to close off by saying, first of all, to respond to 2 things that Peretz Rodman said. One is this is not a fundraising meeting, and that is absolutely true. We're not here to ask everybody to make contributions. It is true that the Masorti movement does great work, and I contribute to it through both my own personal funds and the discretionary funds, and it's great work. You can contribute on their website to individual kehilot. Our former member Martin Sinkoff is very involved at Kehilat Sinai in Tel Aviv, and he encourages people to give to his group, and it's definitely worth your support. Certainly. The second thing I want to say is I think that what Peretz said about the fear of 2 different Jewish communities, I think is very, very to the point. A very, very different set of experiences for us in North America. I really don't know very much about European or South Latin American Judaism, but in the United States, we really do have a very different set of experiences than Israeli Jews, a different set of challenges, and a different set of responses. And some of those things we here in North America are very, very good at, and Israel could use a dose of what we have to offer. And there are things that Israelis are very, very good at that we in America need to get a dose of as well. And my experience of it, in lots of ways, but many summers working at Camp Ramah in these last 10 or 12 years, with the mishlachat of the delegation of Israeli staffers, has been exactly as Peretz said, the gaps in communication, gaps in experiences and even values. And I think that it behooves us to work really hard to nurture these ties and to remain connected to our Israeli brothers and sisters, they've got a lot to teach us. We've got a lot to offer them. Ruvain asked about the demographics. I think that one of the best things for Israel, if there were another 500,000 American Jews moved to Israel, I think there'd be a lot of good ramifications from that. Leave that as it is. But for the week of,
we'll be expecting you and Amy soon then.
I wish we would. If I win the lotto, then we are. But my youngest child's going on the gap year at Bina next year. So 2020 is the first calendar year that I have not been in Israel in a really long time. So hopefully 2021 we'll get to visit. But for Chag HaAtzmaut, the 73rd, we want to celebrate you, celebrate your work, and remain tied with avotot ahava, bonds of love, ropes of love connect us to you, and we wish you all a Chag HaAtzmaut Sameach.